The October jobs report, a blatant display of BLS manipulation. Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Insights brought to you by Ainslie Bullion and the Gold and Silver Standard. Today, we welcome back Branko, who's delivered some pretty damning evidence of manipulation by the Bureau of Labour Statistics today, related to the most recent jobs report. It raises really several questions about what is really going on when you can't trust those official numbers, which I'm pretty keen to dig into and discuss today. So how are you going today, Branko?
Good. Thanks, Chris. Keen to discuss today's topic. It's going to be an interesting discussion.
It is an interesting one because this is official, like it's official government data, but there's a lot of sort of questions that you raise that really do require a bit of deeper analysis and really some answers, ideally. So let's just start off. Can you give us a bit of an overview of what the October jobs report actually said? So what was the October jobs report?
Yeah, so basically, before we kind of delve into some of the more specifics, we'll just get into it underperformed. It was below expectation. And so they only added 150,000 jobs, and they were supposed to add 180,000. So that was probably headline number one, that non-farm payrolls were under expectation. And then number two would be that unemployment rose by to 3.9%, which does fit. There was just a quick note on this, but there was an economist called Claudia Sami, who has a rule about unemployment and recession, and then the way that unemployment has moved the past 3 months kind of fits that bill. So that's another interesting note. But just as a basic thing, you got it coming in below expectation, and then also you've got the unemployment rise. So that was kind of the headline. But as we'll get into it, there's a lot of stuff underneath the hood that is also very concerning and kind of shows some manipulation as well.
Yeah, so that's where we really need to dig in. So what are you talking about there? So what exactly can you sort of talk about in terms of how the figures are manipulated? Because I think people generally have a feeling that they might have been manipulated. And we've heard bits and pieces of this from various sort of media outlets over the last year, really. But can you give us some specifics there about what's going on?
Yeah, so I think kind of some key themes for this discussion would be, I think numbers are important, but also like the way people view the economy and feel about the economy and it affects their lives is just as much, if not more, of a representation of the actual the state of an economy. So the first point I want to bring up is just looking back at the history of these reports by the Bureau of Labour Statistics is that, and this is quite a damning statistic, 8 of the past 9 previous monthly job reports have been revised down significantly. So that's probably not a coincidence. They're probably wanting, in my opinion, not just my opinion, but that isn't a coincidence. They want to get a decent headline out there. The Biden administration or any administration, whoever's in charge, wants to produce the best possible kind of headline. So that's the first point. And then just some more information on that. So, August jobs got revised down from 227,000 to 165,000 that were opened up. So that's
big
quite a significant difference. Yeah, probably more than 25% difference there, discrepancy. And then we saw September go from 336 to 297. So again, and then this is over the past 9 months. That's the first point. And then the second point, which is an interesting one just to quickly raise, is that so there was this thing called the birth-death adjustment, which apparently this month in October is the second largest ever. So that's just another example of, they can kind of create these adjustments and seasonalize it and whatnot, and it might not necessarily be the reality. And I've got a graph that can kind of show this, but yeah, basically what you need to know is the birth-death adjustment doesn't really add up to the reality of the situations that they're saying. So they're probably the two of the main ones. And then just some other interesting notes would be that the jobs that they say they created, a lot of those are government jobs and low-paying jobs. So, if you create a lot more low-paying jobs, is that really a good reflection, of the economy? Maybe not. Just a quick stat on that. So apparently there were 150,000 jobs created in October. A third of those were government. And then basically the remaining were all like lower paying jobs and in the education or health and services. So yeah, just a few points there that could lead to some kind of manipulation.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot of things there actually that you've just mentioned, because we've got a lot of, I suppose we could call them assumptions that are being made around what is actually impacting unemployment. And then I take it from how you're sort of analyzing that, they're really extrapolating that forward to say, well, based on these assumptions, we can therefore say that these numbers should be this. And then they're coming back in the next month and saying, well, that wasn't actually what it really was based on I'm assuming based on real data. So when they're actually looking at probably more fundamental data about who's got a job and who doesn't. But I suppose there's another aspect of that as well. So the two parts to this question. One is, are there any other assumptions around there that don't make sense from your perspective? But also, why would they do that? Do you think that it ultimately comes down to everyone pays a lot of attention to the headline number, no one pays a lot of attention to the revisions? So when that number comes out at 10 o'clock at night our time, or 10:30, everyone's sort of paying attention to that. The markets really move on that, and then they kind of get away with it. Is that sort of the assumption that you're making there too, of why they might want to do it? Because they get away with it for a bit of time, things are looking good, and then they've basically bought themselves another month of full momentum.
A great point. Kind of like when the media would release a story and maybe there's some false information in the newspaper, and then the headline will be, this or whatever. And then a month later, they'll have a tiny, tiny section, that same newspaper, that says, retraction, the drugs that were found in this person's house was actually soap or something, something silly like that. And people don't look at that little retraction, they just see the headline. And I think at the end of the day, as sad as it is to say, I don't know the specifics of how the BLS is funded or these institutions are funded, but to some extent, we have to assume there's some government involvement there, and the BLS would have an incentive, no matter the government, to just, for it to have positive numbers. So I think that's sort of what actually drives some of this potential manipulation. And another actually key point you mentioned, further assumptions I want to make, is this idea of multiple jobs. So another point in the October jobs report is that record number of people are taking on multiple jobs. Not only does that kind of affect the data in itself, in that people have one or two jobs, that can obviously skew the numbers, but also it kind of shows the cost of living crisis that's going on as well. Yes. If you have people that are forced, sure, some people might do it just for the extra income, but a lot of these people are forced, especially if, like we said earlier, a lot of these jobs are created on the lower paying end, right? They have multiple jobs just to survive. So again, that isn't a positive statement on the economy if you need multiple jobs just to afford the rent.
Yep. Whereas a positive number is interpreted, in terms of the markets, is interpreted as a positive to say, oh, well, everything's looking good. But when you dig into the detail of that, it's a whole different story.
Actually, a good example would be if you have 150,000, if you have, say, 75,000 Uber drivers that get created, and then 75,000, I don't know, Uber, just another example, but it's you're doing, or DD drivers. So you have 75,000 Uber drivers and 75,000 DD drivers. That could be 150, but those two people are probably doing the same job twice.
Yes.
And 60 hours. So really, it's not 150 jobs added, it's 75, but the data objectively would say 150.
And that probably brings me to the last question to wrap all of this up. We know, people certainly feel that. We feel that here. I know we're talking about US data, but we also feel it here, that real people, like people on the ground, you and I, and the people that we're speaking to, don't feel like it's a rosy situation out there. They feel, exactly to your last point, that they have to take on that second job because they don't have a choice. It comes down to, do I want any hope of getting a house or getting into the housing market, for example, or the alternative is I'm stuck renting on minimum sort of viable income coming in to be able to make those ends meet. So how do you think about that? What are real people saying about the job market and how it's affecting them versus the data that we get that maybe is telling a very different story, as you've highlighted so far?
Yeah, so I'll put up a quick graph, but it's basically the jobs versus a household survey versus what the establishment BLS is saying. And it's quite clear that employees, households view the job market very differently than what the traditional kind of BLS, bureau level statistics is saying. And I think, again, at the end of the day, we can see this discrepancy, and you can, talking to real people, you can see it. And I think it's a better, in my opinion, a better view on the economy is how regular people are seeing things, and not just necessarily the data. So,
yeah, and that's always going to be the tough line to balance, because the data is the data. But the data should be the data. It should be effectively completely objective and no room for not even necessarily manipulation. There should be no room for misinterpretation. But that's consistently what we've seen. You've pointed that out. It's consistently what we've seen. So in that situation, if you've got people, and when we say people, we're not just talking about one or two people. It's you can pretty much have this conversation with anyone and they'll tell you the same story. So there has to be something in that, right?
Absolutely. And I think at the end of the day, just the key point again to drive home, 8 of the 9 previous job reports were revised down significantly. So the data, at least at first glance, isn't reliable. And that's, in my opinion, done on purpose to some extent. And, what doesn't lie is when people, that are struggling, people express their views, and that's a very constant theme. That's, more reliable than a consistently revised Bureau of Labour Statistics report.
Yep. Well, that makes a lot of sense. Well, thank you for that today, Branko. It is an interesting one to look at. We do, I know that's US data, but it's relevant everywhere, right? Like we're all sort of feeling that same situation. And let's face it, at the moment, the world's certainly the advanced economies are all behaving the same way. So anything that's happening in the US is really reflected quite well here. So I think that's really useful for everyone.
100% agree with that.
All right. And thanks everyone else for watching. Remember, if you've got any questions or comments, reach out on those social platforms. That's us for today. We'll be back tomorrow with Sam to discuss all things markets and metals. Until then, have a great rest of the day, everyone.